Here's the piece no one on that podium dared to confront today. Iran's foreign ministry confirmed at dawn that Tehran will not dispatch negotiators to Pakistan for the second round. The ceasefire clock runs out Wednesday. Still, Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner boarded flights to Islamabad as if the meeting still existed. And then there's China, the power underwriting Iran's resistance through oil revenue, the same power accused of enabling precision targeting against American positions, the same veto holder that shut down every enforcement path Washington pushed through the Security Council. China said nothing, not a single line about Iran walking away. No acknowledgement of the Tuska, the Iranian cargo vessel seized Sunday while en route from China. No call from Wang Yi urging Tehran back into the room. Just silence. And I want to sit inside that silence for a moment, because what China isn't saying may be more decisive than anything spoken publicly by Washington or Tehran. But to understand that, you have to first dismantle the way this refusal is being sold. The coverage is off, completely off. Every headline paints Iran as stubborn, reckless, dragging its feet while the clock ticks down. The narrative is simple. Iran is the obstacle, put them on a plane, and the deal materializes. But that interpretation collapses the moment you actually examine Iran's behavior. This is not defiance for the sake of defiance. This is calculation, cold, deliberate, informed by something very specific. Go back to round one. 21 hours in Islamabad, the highest level direct contact between the US and Iran since 1979. Vance and Ghaliba seated across from each other, Pakistani mediators watching every exchange. And when it ended, Ghaliba said something precise, something that wasn't emotional, wasn't reactive. He said they entered with goodwill, with intent, but after 2 wars, trust no longer exists. That statement matters, because he didn't question capability. He didn't question leverage. He exposed something deeper, a complete collapse of trust. Look at the pattern. The US signed the JCPOA in 2015, then dismantled it in 2018. A ceasefire was declared, and within that same window, a naval blockade appeared. The president told reporters Iran had already agreed to everything. Iran's foreign ministry immediately contradicted that, publicly. Araghchi claimed they were on the brink of a deal before the terms shifted mid-process. One US official told Reuters they were 80% of the way there. Think about that. 20% away from the most consequential agreement in decades, and the framework moved. Then Sunday happens. A US naval strike hits the engine room of an Iranian cargo vessel. Marines descend from helicopters onto its deck. The seizure is announced not through diplomacy, but on social media. And that ship, it was traveling from China to Iran. Araghchi didn't frame that as escalation. He called it proof, evidence that diplomacy isn't being taken seriously. Iran's state outlet IRNA went further, labeling the second round a staged performance, a media script designed to assign blame rather than secure a deal. That's not stubbornness, that's pattern recognition. That's a country that has watched agreements dissolve, watched narratives shift, and learned, painfully, what verbal commitments are worth once the cameras shut off. But there's another layer here, one almost completely ignored. The Iran being discussed in headlines isn't a single entity moving in one direction. It's fractured. It's operating on 2 tracks at once. And if you miss that, you miss the entire story. There is the Iran represented by Abbas Araghchi, the diplomat, the deal maker, the man who spent 21 hours inside peregrinations in Islamabad and publicly signaled that Hormuz remained open on Friday. That version of Iran is still reaching for a deal. It understands the blockade is not theoretical. It understands that if the ceasefire collapses on Wednesday and airstrikes return, the next phase won't look like the last. It will be far more punishing. But running parallel to that is another power center entirely, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the hardline faction that overruled Araghchi within hours of his Hormuz statement, that deployed gunboats to harass tankers the very next day, that issued retaliation threats immediately after the Tuska seizure. These are not minor disagreements. These are 2 competing command structures pulling in opposite directions at the exact same moment. And that fracture is the real story. Because while Washington believes it's negotiating with one Iran, the other Iran is actively escalating at sea. The contradiction between official statements and battlefield behavior, that tension you're hearing between announcements and actions, that is not confusion. That is an internal struggle unfolding in real time. One side is trying to stabilize the situation. The other is preparing for confrontation, and both are operating simultaneously. Now shift to China, because China understood all of this before choosing to remain silent. It has been the most consequential external force in this conflict, not through visible intervention, but through 3 calculated moves executed quietly from the very beginning. First, it has kept Iran economically breathing. Before the war, Iran exported roughly 1.68 million barrels of oil per day. At the height of the conflict, when Hormuz was partially shut and U.S. bombing campaigns intensified, that number didn't fall. It rose, 1.84 million barrels per day, higher than pre-war levels. That shouldn't be possible. Not for a country that just lost senior leadership, absorbed direct strikes on nuclear infrastructure, and saw its air defenses degraded. And yet it happened. Because the system sustaining those exports doesn't operate in the open. China's shadow network, tankers running with falsified signals, vessels flying flags from landlocked nations, mid-sea transfers in Malaysian waters, financial routing through secondary Chinese banks completely outside the SWIFT system, has insulated Iran from pressure. Officially, China reports 0 Iranian oil imports. On paper, the trade doesn't exist. But at the same time, China's import logs show Malaysian crude surging to 1.3 million barrels per day, more than twice Malaysia's total production capacity. That discrepancy doesn't resolve unless the origin is being concealed. The numbers don't just bend, they break. Right now, over 157 million barrels of Iranian crude are at sea. Nearly all of it, over 97%, is moving toward China, and the current blockade framework can't touch it. Even United States Central Command language quietly carves out that exception. Vessels bound for non-Iranian ports are not to be stopped. That clause wasn't accidental, it was surgical. Because here's what that looks like in reality. Donald Trump publicly declared that any vessel paying transit fees to Iran would be intercepted. But Chinese state-linked COSCO shipping tankers continued moving through the strait, paying those same tolls. By the public standard, they should have been seized. They weren't, because operational directives told a different story. A tanker loading at Karg Island and heading to a Chinese refinery is technically traveling from an Iranian port to a non-Iranian destination. Under that wording, it passes through untouched. The distance between what Donald Trump declared and what United States Central Command actually enforced isn't some bureaucratic slip. It's intentional, a calculated line drawn in advance, because the moment you stop a Chinese state-owned tanker in open waters, it stops being about Iran. It becomes about China. And a direct confrontation with China is an entirely different level of escalation, one Washington is clearly not ready to trigger. Second, China has shielded Iran on the diplomatic front just as effectively. When the US pushed for a UN resolution to authorize force and reopen Hormuz, China, alongside Russia, shut it down. No coalition formed, no international backing followed. Meanwhile, Wang Yi was working the phones relentlessly. 26 calls over the course of the war, with Iran consistently included, and then something more revealing surfaced. According to leaked Iranian documents reported by the Financial Times, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps relied on satellite imagery provided by a Chinese commercial firm, EarthICO, to map out American military positions. Targets included Prince Sultan Air Base, Muwafaq Salti Air Base, and strategic locations near the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. CBS News independently confirmed this through 2 U.S. officials. That means China didn't just keep Iran economically afloat, it enhanced Iran's visibility on the battlefield. It helped Iran see. Third, and this connects directly to the moment we're in now, China intervened to influence Hormuz itself. Last Thursday, Wang Yi called Abbas Araghchi and pushed for the strait to be reopened. By Friday, Iran publicly declared it was open. Trump responded immediately, posting "Thank you" in all caps. Oil prices dropped 9% almost overnight, and then the sequence broke. The U.S. maintained its blockade on Iranian ports. Iran reversed course and tightened restrictions again. IRGC gunboats engaged tankers on Saturday. On Sunday, the Tuska was seized, and through all of it, China said nothing. China pressured Iran to open Hormuz. Iran complied. The US didn't adjust its position. Iran escalated again. A vessel linked to China was intercepted, and still, silence. To understand that silence, you have to read it like a signal. Because in global politics, when a major power goes quiet, it's never empty. It's intentional. The real question isn't why China stayed silent. It's who is interpreting that silence and how. Iran is reading it very carefully. Here's the sequence as Tehran sees it. China's last visible move was urging de-escalation and open navigation. Since then, a Chinese-linked vessel was seized. Iran threatened retaliation. American officials moved forward with talks anyway. Iran refused to attend, and China did not intervene. No pressure, no correction, no public stance. That silence doesn't read as neutrality. It reads as permission, not stated outright, but embedded in behavior, because the fundamentals haven't changed. China is still buying Iranian oil, still blocking UN enforcement measures, still providing the economic cushion that allows Iran to resist pressure. And from Beijing's perspective, staying silent right now carries less cost than stepping in. Think about what speaking up would actually mean. If Wang Yi publicly demands the release of the Tuska, China implicitly confirms that the shipment served its own strategic interests. That invites scrutiny. What was on board, and how deep does that supply relationship go? If China pressures Iran back into negotiations and Iran walks away again, Beijing inherits responsibility for a failure it doesn't control. That's risk China has no interest in absorbing. So instead, China positions itself differently. It wants to be credited if a deal happens, but not blamed for anything that unfolds before it. And the cleanest way to maintain that balance is silence. Iran understands that calculation, and it adjusts accordingly. If your primary partner continues to fund your economy, shields you diplomatically, and stays quiet when you escalate, then your margin to refuse just expanded. The cost of saying no just dropped. This isn't passive, it's strategic restraint. China's foreign ministry briefs the press daily. The Tuska seizure happened Sunday. By Monday, the global media had confirmed its origin. If Beijing wanted to respond, it had both the platform and the timing. It chose not to. That absence isn't accidental, it's a decision. And structurally, that decision serves China. Because if Iran signs a comprehensive agreement, ends the war, reopens Hormuz under US terms, accepts nuclear limits, the entire balance shifts. Iran gains access to Western markets, sanctions ease, and suddenly it doesn't need to sell discounted crude to Chinese refiners. China loses its privileged position as Iran's primary buyer. At the same time, Washington proves its strategy works, and the energy instability that has been quietly boosting China's dominance in solar, batteries, and EV exports disappears. That outcome doesn't benefit Beijing, which is why the current posture makes sense. As one Al-Monitor analysis put it, China presents itself as a mediator, while allowing the US to absorb the cost of the conflict. It calls for peace in every official statement, but when the moment arrives to shape the outcome directly, it steps back and lets the silence do the work. China continues to absorb Iranian oil flows regardless of sanctions. It nudges Tehran toward negotiations when that aligns with its own economic priorities, like the temporary reopening of Hormuz. And when those negotiations unravel, when Iran declines to attend, when the US intercepts a vessel tied to Chinese origin, Beijing remains silent. Because the current state of the conflict, prolonged, unresolved, costly for Washington, and quietly advantageous for China, serves its interests more than a decisive American win ever could. There's another layer to this. A high-stakes summit between Donald Trump and Chinese leadership is set for May 14th in Beijing. Trade tensions, technology disputes, Taiwan, everything converges around that meeting. Every move China makes right now is filtered through one question: does this complicate that summit or protect it? If China were to formally protest the Tuska seizure, it would force Trump to publicly address Chinese involvement in undermining his own blockade strategy. That creates friction before Air Force One even lands. Beijing won't risk that. Not for a single vessel, not even one linked to its own networks. The summit carries more weight than the ship. Now, to fairly test this analysis, you have to examine Washington's argument at its strongest. The U.S. position is that pressure is working. The blockade has already turned back 25 ships. Iran's currency has dropped 15%. Its central bank is warning of a recovery timeline stretching over a decade. In Islamabad, Iran reportedly came within 80% of a deal. The ceasefire in Lebanon removed a major Iranian condition. Officials have directly tied the opening of Hormuz to developments in Lebanon, and Lebanon did stabilize. And inside Iran itself, there's visible contradiction. While the foreign ministry publicly rejected travel, parliamentary security figure Ibrahim Azizi suggested a delegation could still be sent within days. Two voices, same government, completely different directions. That's not random. It reflects internal division. We've seen this before. Iran publicly rejected talks before round one, then sent a 70-member delegation anyway. So the current refusal may not be final. It could be positioning. And Vance traveling to Pakistan despite that refusal isn't desperation, it's strategy. It signals to mediators, Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, that the US showed up. If no deal happens, Iran will be seen as the side that stayed away. That narrative matters. It shapes what comes next, whether that's extending the ceasefire, resuming strikes, or attempting a third round. Trump's statement that the concept of the deal is done may reflect real back-channel movement. Axios reported that mediators still believe a framework is within reach. Pakistan's prime minister has been moving between Jeddah, Doha, and Antalya. Asim Munir traveled to Tehran and was greeted warmly by Abbas Araghchi, a signal that communication channels remain active. Even Araghchi's language matters. When he called the seizure proof of America's lack of seriousness in diplomacy, not war, that distinction reveals intent. That's the language of someone still maneuvering toward a deal, not abandoning one. And taken together, that argument holds. Pressure is real. Internal divisions in Iran are real. A deal before Wednesday isn't likely, but it isn't impossible either. But here's where that argument breaks. Every escalation cycle produces movement until it doesn't. There's a ceiling, and that ceiling exists because Iran's ability to endure pressure extends beyond what US tools can fully reach. As long as China continues absorbing over 150 million barrels of Iranian crude through systems designed to bypass sanctions entirely, Iran has what it needs, not comfort, but survival, enough to refuse, enough to delay, enough to escalate selectively while maintaining leverage. The US strategy is built on constriction, but it's trying to squeeze a system that still has a functioning lifeline. And the country holding that lifeline just chose silence when its own linked vessel was seized. So watch the next 48 hours carefully. Not the statements, but the signals. First, does China say anything specific about the Tuska? Not general calls for stability, something direct about a vessel tied to its networks being intercepted. If Beijing stays silent, it's choosing ambiguity over confrontation. If it speaks, it means a threshold has been crossed. Second, does Wang Yi call Araghchi again before Wednesday? His last intervention triggered the temporary reopening of Hormuz. Another call would signal that China now prefers resolution over prolonged uncertainty. No call means the opposite, that the current stalemate still serves its interests. Third, what does Iran actually do, not what it says? One official rejects talks. Another suggests participation. That contradiction reflects a deeper split between the diplomatic track and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps hardliners. If a delegation arrives in Islamabad despite public refusal, diplomacy won internally. If no one shows, the hardline faction prevailed, and the ceasefire likely expires without resolution. So test this, challenge it. Look at how foreign policy described China's muted reaction. Read Al-Monitor on Beijing balancing peace rhetoric with strategic advantage. Examine the Financial Times reporting on satellite support. Go back to the original statement about trust, not capability, as the core issue. then ask the question no briefing is answering. China's last visible move was pushing Iran to reopen Hormuz. Since then, a vessel linked to China was seized. Iran threatened retaliation. The ceasefire is days from expiring, and China has said nothing. If Tehran is reading that silence, and it is, then Beijing's restraint is shaping this negotiation more than any public statement coming out of Washington or Tehran.